more than 10 local newsrooms that have closed just since this started. Jim mentioned the work of UNC and their news deserts, and 1,800 newsrooms we've lost since 2004. And I think 1,600 of those were weekly newspapers, so places that were serving smaller communities. And it's often rural communities that don't have access to information. Those are the places where this news is not coming back. So there are lots of solutions. There are lots of opportunities for people to support local news right now. And I think the message is starting to get through that local news is more important than ever. It's critical to understand. I mean, it's life or death in many cases. But the Pew Research Center did a study maybe a year ago, and they found that 70% of people that they surveyed had no idea that there were any problems with the finances of their local newsrooms. So in large part, while people who follow the media have known that this has been a problem, I think people who aren't as plugged in have been unaware of the very, very dire conditions that local newsrooms have found themselves in. And now, it's disappearing before our eyes. I do want to say it's not just newspapers that are in trouble, and it's not just, at the local level. Because of consolidation, newsrooms are owned more and more by big corporations. And one of the things that I have found striking in covering layoffs is the number of radio stations, nationally owned radio stations that serve markets in several states that have had layoffs and furloughs. And so you may not be a news junkie, you may not be somebody who listens to public radio or as a subscriber to your local newsroom, but you might get bits of news in the car, on talk radio, or on as you listen to music while you're traveling to work, taking your kids to school. Those resources are also now fading. And so what we're facing, in the last month is sort of the evaporation of news in a lot of places.
And like you say, the contradiction today is that during the health crisis is when real information that reaches people in their own language, in their own sort of environment and culture and community is crucial to prevent the spread of sanitary disease. So today is when the news is more needed and when it's in crisis. I understand that at the Poynter Institute, you used to work on issues of immigration, race, age, as well, and discrimination. Would you say that tragically, when you have a pandemic, it normally affects the poorest communities the more, and in that sense, it would also affect the media in those communities, and the most rural and weak economically communities will be affected the most?
Yeah, definitely. I covered race, immigration, and aging at the St. Louis Beacon for 5 years before coming to Poynter. And, one of the things I can tell you from covering those beats to then covering local media and the media in general is the media has a representation problem. We have a diversity problem. We have for a very, very, very long time. And in most places, newsrooms in the U.S., particularly local newsrooms, do not look like the communities that they serve. So that's a huge problem. And I think we're seeing great reporting both nationally and locally that's showing the very dangerous impact of COVID-19 on underrepresented populations. And, I have concerns that there are newsrooms that are unequipped to cover those stories because they are not plugged into those communities.
Sure. And Michael, you have a totally different perspective on this, which I think is also very interesting. You have worked freedom of expression and freedom of the press from a human rights perspective, from an international bodies, with the Inter-American Human Rights System, with the State Department, and in terms of foreign policy, and in the legal cases handled through Sahil initially. What is your feeling of the crisis aggravated by the pandemic that we live today, but also with what we see? It appears that journalism and free press was already under challenge, not only in the US, but also in the hemisphere. I mean, worldwide, if you look at it worldwide, even in Hungary or in Poland, and obviously in Russia and China and other places. But in the Western Hemisphere where we live, there's many of the presidents and political leaders that are curtailing the legislation that allows for freedom of expression, freedom of the press. What's your perspective on the reality of journalism and free press today.
Yeah, thank you, Frank, and thank you to the whole Fundamedios team for convening this conversation. It's great to be with everyone. As you mentioned, my perspectives may be a little bit different, having worked on these issues from the perspective of international human rights law and international relations. I think what's probably most striking and frankly quite disturbing is the degree to which President Trump's approach to the press both mimics that of some of the authoritarian leaders we've seen in Latin America, where much of my work is focused, and by all appearances seems to encourage the vitriolic behavior of some of the current crop of leaders in the region. I'm always on this issue reminded of a Latin American colleague who was asked whether he had ever heard of a president calling the media the enemy of the people and crying fake news whenever a press report not to his liking emerged. And the colleague said, yes, but never in English. So obviously that's slightly tongue-in-cheek, but I think for those like you, Frank, and like me, and many people on this call, I'm sure, who have been tracking press freedom developments in the hemisphere, there are in the messages and in the actions emanating from President Trump and his team clear echoes of former presidents in Latin America who are not exactly remembered as champions of press freedom. So when Trump bullies the press and accuses it of brandishing lies in an attempt to undermine him, he invokes Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, or Rafael Correa in Ecuador, or Cristina Kirchner in Argentina, or Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. When he uses or threatens to use the administrative power of the state to withdraw operating licenses or to dent the profits of their owners, he evokes Chavez or Alberto Fujimori in Peru. When he talks about changing libel laws or he files spurious defamation suits, I think Jim alluded to many of these things. He reminds many of us of Correa's efforts in Ecuador. When he traffics in misinformation, when he cultivates media outlets that puppet his version of reality, he again brings to mind Chavez. And when his targets in the press becomes the victims of real-world violence, the current context reminds many of us of Colombia under Álvaro Uribe. So all of these issues I've mentioned, these actions by Chavez, Correa, Kirchner, Fujimori, Uribe, Ortega, and others, they've came before the inter-American human rights system in one form or the other. And as a result, today we have a really rich and strong collection of regional jurisprudence on defamation laws, on indirect forms of censorship, on the duty of leaders and public officials to protect journalists and human rights defenders, and on the elevated responsibility of public officials to verify the information that they share with the public and to refrain from comments that could put citizens in danger. Much of this jurisprudence, ironically, is inspired by the rich First Amendment tradition we have here in the United States. So needless to say, it's surprising and quite unnerving to see so many of these patterns of attack on the free press repeat themselves here in the United States.
Yes. And like you say, it's terrible after defending the First Amendment and setting a precedent with the First Amendment. It's terrible to see the reality today. Going back to you, Jim, after you in a way, I cut you off when you were presenting the reality of journalism today, and we moved to look at it from different perspectives, and especially with Kristen, and looking at what the Poynter Institute does, we're looking at the effects of COVID-19. What would you say, looking at it from the perspective of the Press Club and your work there, the effects, the added effects, I should say, or the added crisis of the COVID will do to journalism? What is the prospect? What do we see toward the future for journalism? How could journalism come out of this difficult reality, on one, on sustainability, which was already in crisis, as you say, but on the other, of this confrontational mode that political leaders around the world in general are having?
Right. Well, there's different ways to approach that question. I think even before COVID, I guess the thing to say about this administration's treatment of the press, and particularly the president's, is that the biggest political threat is obviously some of the things that Katie was talking about, the legal underminings and so on. But I think that the threat that lingers long after President Trump is gone is that the polarization that he has fostered will undermine the credibility of the press for a long time to come. That's going to be harder to kind of claw back, and because he has poisoned the well, so to speak. Having said that, I think the one thing that this pandemic has done, it has perhaps made the public aware of, to some extent, the essential nature of the press. And if we look at some data, and Kristen alluded to some of this, obviously, but there was a Pew poll, for instance, that found that more than half of U.S. adults said they were following news of the pandemic very closely. An additional 35% said they were following the news fairly closely. 54% of adults said the news media had done an excellent or good job covering the outbreak. And there was a New York Times analysis of online data use that found that local news sites have received much of that increased attention. So the good news is that the public recognizes the role of the press as a purveyor of believable information. The bad news is that much of this access on the part of consumers, news consumers, has been because it's been accessible for free. A lot of, to their credit, a lot of news organizations dropped their paywalls so that people could access the information about COVID easily. And so there's that element of it. But I just, over the past week, I've been talking to some editors. There's a hyper local news organization called Patch that serves neighborhoods throughout the country. I believe they're in over 1,200 communities. They saw an increase of 255,000 email subscriptions over the course of COVID. Other news organizations are seeing similar increases. So the question is, how sustainable is that given their financial picture? And the financial picture is obviously leans on the bad to horrible side. But there are some little green shoots there that might be signals for how the press can survive in this country. And that is that there are organizations that are starting to raise money for newspapers. There's one called the Local Media Association. They've created a COVID-19 local media fund that is you can give to that organization a tax deductible donation that then gets distributed to various newspapers. Right now, during the time of the pandemic, they have raised $500,000, and they're distributing it among 200 publishers. They've had over 6,000 contributors. So if there is anything that looks like a silver lining here, it's that the public is beginning to recognize, or at least elements of the public are beginning to recognize that there is an essential role for the news media, and we might start seeing different models emerge as to how to fund them. It will never come back to what it was before, and we will likely still have news deserts, but it might be a way to extend a rather thin lifeline to some of these news organizations. But again, to go back to your question, Frank, I think the main issue here is the lingering threat on the credibility of the press that the president's rhetoric and his actions have created.
I think I hear you. I mean, I think everyone recognizes that in a time of crisis like today, and especially a health crisis, information is crucial. So the media becomes much more important than in normal times. And I think the media has become friendlier to the population than even the statements by political leaders. On the other hand, like you say, the crisis of sustainability was already there from before. And I don't think we're going to be going back to the old times, as you mentioned. But on one hand, the press has gained credibility. On the other hand, there's a challenge, and I wanted to ask you about that in a brief way. A challenge to be more critical, don't you think? Because it's covering something as crucial as a pandemic with so many opinions, and especially opinions of people who are not experts on health, who are trying to invent solutions or to propose medications that had not been tested or not been done. It means that the press has to be much more critical in presenting the different views and having people a more critical perspective of these issues.
Well, we certainly know of the president's poor relationship with the truth, and so that has required specific attention from the press. We have, I think, fact checking has become a cottage industry among journalists. But I guess the question becomes, to what degree and how does that accountability take place? Because for a long time, we were critical of the White House for not holding briefings. They went, I can't remember how many months without holding a single briefing for reporters, and that was damaging for public information. The public was not getting an on-the-record representation of what the White House was doing, except for the president's tweets and his remarks to reporters, kind of extemporaneous, these extemporaneous press conferences that would take place upon his departure or during an Oval Office spray or so on. Then the White House started holding daily press briefings with the president as the kind of master of ceremonies, and then the pundits were very critical of the way that in arguing that reporters shouldn't be covering those at all because it was giving the president too much of a microphone and he was turning them into essentially mini versions of his rallies. So it becomes this balance. What is it that we want, and how is it that we can provide it under the circumstances?
I hear you. Katie, what in terms of the cases and looking again at the models of journalism that we were talking and how the challenges for journalists in the future and the sustainability, in the cases that you're looking at, I imagine that the more lawsuits that a journalist has to face or the media have to face puts an additional economic burden on them. What has been your experience, and is there a way to redress that if they demonstrate that these are frivolous lawsuits?
Yeah, there are in some jurisdictions, there are certainly ways to address that. There are special laws, what are called anti-SLAPP statutes that exist in certain jurisdictions, including the District of Columbia, that enable, for example, that enable the early dismissal of frivolous claims arising out of an exercise of free expression, including reporting, for example, on a matter of public concern, and then can also enable someone who prevails on such a motion, a journalist, for example, or a news organization, to recover attorney's fees, which can go a long way, not only to deterring frivolous lawsuits, but also making sure that news organizations and journalists are not being, sort of targeted with these harassing suits for the purposes of draining resources. I think just to step back a little bit to take kind of a bigger picture view of sort of the legal landscape, I think one of the things to sort of keep in mind is the importance of, quite frankly, rule of law in this country. I mean, we do have a very robust history of First Amendment jurisprudence that provides very strong protections for journalists and news organizations. And I think even when we've seen some of these, what might seem like politically motivated actions taken by the administration, I think, for example, of Frank, the Jim Acosta case that you mentioned earlier, the sort of revocation of the CNN White House correspondent's hard pass. There was the Brian Karem case as well, kind of a similar legal issue. In both cases, the federal district courts in DC stepped in to not necessarily on a First Amendment basis, but on a due process basis to determine that it was improper to revoke those credentials absent proper due process. One of those cases, the Karem case, is now before the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. I think it's important for courts, or will be even more important for courts, as these as we are in a situation where, and I think there's been this polarization and this attitude towards the news media, for courts to really stand up and to enforce the legal protections that are in place for the exercise of First Amendment rights. I would say, just as maybe a note of caution, that said, the Trump administration has been quite effective in remaking the federal judiciary and in appointing numerous judges to federal courts all over the country. So that's something to sort of keep in mind when we think about the protections that we've had for journalists that we almost take for granted. I think, especially as lawyers, we take them for granted when we go to court, that those are really valuable things that need to be preserved as well.
Well, also when people vote for their senators, it's also a question to keep in mind. That exactly was going to be my next question. You have already answered whether there was a feeling that the First Amendment, in a way, is being endangered by being eroded slowly, not obviously in a dramatic way, but slowly within the legal system, or not. And you have answered that very well. And Kristen, going back to the media, I believe that local media, and we have talked about this before with all of you, that in a way local media has had a rebirth with the crisis, to the extent that it has become much more important, because oftentimes it's the most credible media, or it uses the most appropriate language and knows the culture of the community they're speaking to. It can relate to that, and therefore it makes sense to strengthen that community media. But the trend looks to be going the other way. What's your impression and the impression from the Institute to look at that? What is the future of the local media in the country?
Well, it's a good. I would say that like a baby, it's really precious and important and needs help. And I think that newsrooms, Jim brought up, LMA. Tomorrow is Giving Tuesday Now, where newsrooms around the country are going to be asking for support. And even before this, both for-profit and nonprofit newsrooms have been making the case to both their readers, their communities, and big funders, philanthropic local funders, that journalism is important and needs the resources in order for local newsrooms to be able to keep working. And so I think there are lots of solutions. We are, if it's not already over, we are moving out of a phase where there is a one-size-fits-all approach to what works. And every community is going to be different, just like cities and towns are different already. The news organizations that serve them, I think, are going to be really different. And so what you might see in Berkeley, California, where Berkeley side was able to raise $1 million in a direct public offering a few years ago, and is now doing well and covering the community and continues to receive funding from that community. An organization like that won't work in other communities. And so we're going to have a mix of private and public funding. There will be newsrooms that have subscriptions and paywalls, and there will be newsrooms that are open and are funded through support of local and national philanthropic dollars. All of that is a lot of work for newsrooms, and it's a different kind of work than what they're used to. It's membership building, it's subscription building, it takes really good technology. And so, before this crisis, a lot of my job was covering that transition into the tech that and the different disciplines that digital requires. And I think now, times of change are inflection points, and there's often an opportunity to quickly grow and change. I'm working on a story now that asks what sort of resources are newsrooms going to need to continue to stay critical to their communities, to not fade back into the background whenever that happens, life resumes to some form of normal again. And I think that newsrooms have to do a better job of all sizes, listening to their communities, understanding the priorities of the people that live there, and not being just gatekeepers, but context makers for what is happening in your community and why it matters and why you need to know it.
And I was wondering, I mean, you were saying that you were doing before the pandemic an analysis precisely of this sustainability crisis. Are you also doing now an analysis of the good practices of how to survive the pandemic crisis, and also how to adapt to what are going to be the new conditions? Because like everyone says, we're not going to go back to the past.
Yeah.
But it's not very clear what's going to be the future as well, and what are going to be the new formulas.
Yeah, I think we're going to keep watching and waiting to see what happens. But there are places that we know have formulas that work, like the Texas Tribune. Again, that's, not every city is in Austin. There are organizations that are very connected to their communities and are reaching out now and saying, hey, we need help. And there are places, small places that have never before asked. They're free and they've never before asked for funding for their communities. And they're starting to reach out. So I think one of the things we're going to see is a willingness to partner, to collaborate, and to work with your community to get funding in a way where before it was more of a, A to B. We're going to give you information, and then that's how it works. We'll get our funding elsewhere. I think that we're going to see more and more newsrooms opening up to kind of a public media model for support from their communities, and local ownership, I hope, will continue to be a part of that too.
Okay, we also hope. Michael, I wanted to ask you a similar question that we were talking with Katie in terms of, are the current times of difficulty representing a reversal or a weakening, an erosion, a slow erosion of the legal standards that the First Amendment generated, or not? But I would like to ask you for internationally. You were saying the role that the U.S. has played in terms of freedom of expression in particular has always been crucial. And when we look at the continent and the fact that this administration is very friendly to some of the not so critical of some governments, but friendly with some others more to the south, do you think that the erosion of standards of freedom of expression and access to information in the Western Hemisphere is very serious? Something that we're losing slowly, a little bit like the beaches and the seaside and the global warming, and no one is paying enough attention?
Yeah, thanks, Frank. Look, I think, I mentioned a number of examples from just the last, 10, 20 years, which should give us a sense of perspective on what we're seeing now. Unfortunately, attacks on press freedom are not something that's new. In the Americas, there's always been kind of it seems a cohort, ideally, in the best of times, a small one, but nonetheless a cohort of leaders who takes a kind of a belligerent attitude towards the media and tries to erode democratic standards in order to increase their own monopoly on information. So, some of the countries may change, the characters may change, but some of this is not particularly new. I think what is different is, as you mentioned, the role of the United States, which is not always a perfectly consistent advocate of human rights in the Americas or around the world. But I think on the issue of freedom of expression, given our own kind of First Amendment tradition, has been a fairly strong, consistent, kind of bipartisan supporter of freedom of expression, at least within the Americas. And that's changed, I think it's fair to say. Organizations like CPJ have drawn, I think, quite a clear and compelling line between President Trump's treatment of the press here at home and the actions of leaders in places like Pakistan and Tanzania, not to mention places like Turkey or Saudi Arabia, or Egypt. So whereas in the past, some of these leaders might have been constrained to some extent by scrutiny from the U.S. government, under current circumstances, it seems that they're either given a pass or in the worst cases, sort of emboldened by statements or behavior from Trump. And obviously the most contemptible example of this was the letting the Saudi government get away with the murder of Jamal Khashoggi without imposing any serious consequences to that action. Within the Americas, I think this is maybe most clear in the case of Brazil, where President Jair Bolsonaro has really kind of modeled himself on President Trump in terms of his persona. He actively kind of covets Trump's approval. And in his approach to the press, I think we see some of the same kind of disturbing consequences. Just yesterday on World Press Freedom Day, there was a protest outside the presidential office in Brasilia, directed at the target was the Congress and the Supreme Court, institutions that are viewed by some of Bolsonaro's supporters as being kind of adversarial towards him. Bolsonaro went out to address the crowd. There were aggressions physical and verbal against reporters. Bolsonaro was informed of these, and he didn't do anything to step in and kind of defend the press. To the contrary, he made some comments that were critical of the press. So I think you see, unfortunately, a real kind of tangible consequence. And Katie, I think, was right to say that, whereas we see a number of these negative trends in the United States, we have an institutional framework, the Constitution, our laws, our independent judiciary, the press itself that has really been quite robust in creating safeguards around some of Trump's instincts. But that is not the case in some countries where leaders are being inspired, emboldened, or at least kind of given a pass by the United States in terms of its leadership on these issues in the area of Trump. And we're seeing that have real consequences.
Yes, we do. I think we're running out of time, and I also do know, I was reminded today that everyone wants to run out to go see the Pulitzer Prize Awards, so we're very conscious about time. So in the very few minutes, I would like to give a round of final comments of 30 seconds by each one of our panelists, if you could, in looking at this. Is the future really terrible? Because on one hand, we're looking at the importance and the growing importance. On the other hand, we look at an economic crisis. On the other hand, I speak to journalists that tell me that before you had a reporter, a photographer, a producer, then an editor. Now, media has to rely on one person being reporter, photographer, and producer, all in one, and oftentimes editor. Do you envision in 30 seconds a better future or a more dramatic future, or we should rethink journalism altogether? Is it possible for each one of you to give us closing remarks in 30 seconds? Jim?
Well, I'm by nature an optimist, but by career choice a pragmatist. So I would like to think that the political environment is fleeting, and that will change. I think the financial environment is harder to overcome, but I think there are a lot of smart people, and Kristen's one of them, who are looking at what some of the models are out there that might help journalism survive in this country in a way that's sustainable. And so that's what I hope for.
Thank you very much. Katie?
I think I have the optimism of the will. So I too am optimistic, and I think in part it's because, as Kristen said, there's not going to be one answer, one solution to sort of the crisis in local journalism, but I think there's going to be multiple solutions, nonprofit models, collaborative models, different approaches that folks are just now starting to explore. So I'm hopeful that those will work.
Kristen?
I did a story last week about a town in New Hampshire that lost news, and a local librarian started a local newspaper. And when he passed away, 6 people in the community stepped up and are now serving as a voluntary staff of this local newspaper. And because of COVID-19, they've had to adapt very quickly and go online. I think that there will be journalism and hopefully journalists everywhere forever. And I think we have to be open to all the creative ways that citizens are going to find to make sure that keeps happening.
Great. Michael.
Yeah, well, to stay on the optimistic theme, and as somebody who's essentially a consumer of journalism, I think, I'm struck by just the extraordinary work that the journalists are doing. Much of it in Latin America, I would say, in kind of new platforms, especially digital news outlets, places like Guatemala, El Salvador, Colombia. You're seeing Venezuela, even in tough environments, journalists doing extraordinary work. So long may it continue.
Thank you, Michael. Well, with this, I really have to thank the four of you. You have been a wonderful panel, and you're great individuals doing wonderful work. And I also believe we have really commemorated the International World Press Freedom Day with a very optimistic perspective that freedom of expression will always exist, freedom of the press will always be necessary, and journalism is a career with a future. Thank you all very much from Fundamedios. We expect to see you again. We would like to do this once a month, a seminar, to be able to convene all of you interested in these topics again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.